Hi, everybody, and welcome to part two, or officially day two of psychedelic drugs. All right, so today we're going to cover three other general classes of psychedelic drugs. But before diving into that, I want to give a little update or, I guess, refinement on the interesting situation in Portugal where they decriminalized drugs back in 2000. And then we'll go into some of these three other interesting classes of psychedelic drugs, going to the catecholamine class. That includes mescaline, MDMA, or ecstasy. We'll then move into the glutamatergic class. These tend to be dissociative drugs like anesthetics as well. And we'll talk exclusively about ketamine and PCP, and then finish with this kappa opioid receptor based hallucinogenic psychedelic called salvinorin A. And then tomorrow, Thursday, we'll start in on marijuana, CBD, THC, the active ingredients in marijuana. All right. So going back to Portugal, a really interesting story again, as I mentioned last time, where they decriminalize drugs. And I just looking into it more, I found out there's a little more nuance to it. It's like it's decriminalized as a criminal offense, but it's still illegal to have drugs in the sense that you face civil penalties. And so I know it's more complicated than I thought. And so you can't go around the street corner and be buying drugs left and right. So if you had any fantasies of doing that, put that aside because it's still criminal. Plus, you can't go to Portugal right now. So what's going on? So you can think of it more like speeding. So if you speed your car, at least if you do it for a second time or so, you're not going to go to jail. It won't necessarily be a permanent mark on your criminal record. You might get a warning. Again, it won't enter your criminal record. You might have to take a class. You might have to see some judge or so. But again, it won't enter your permanent criminal record. So that's what it's meant by decriminalizing. But it's still illegal to speed. And same way, it's still illegal to possess or manufacture drugs in Portugal. You might, in that case, they're really focused more on helping people with addiction or issues. And so what you often would have to do then is if you're caught with drugs or so, let's say you have heroin on you, you might have to see counselors or go to treatment and things like that, which sounds like a great idea. And so that's the nuance there. If you want more information on Portugal's take on dealing with drug issues and drug-related mortality rates and things, check out that link as well to get more details. All right. In other news, I'm not going to have time to go through it here, but it's a really fascinating timeline of the history of the development of psychedelic drugs going back 5,000 years or so up into the much more recent, like this year, recent present. Great pictures and just some really good links. It's a very, very detailed, long timeline, but it's fun to go through. So the link is there. So check that out as well. Okay, moving on. Okay, so last time I mentioned some of the ways that psychedelic drugs can be categorized. You can do it by how they affect your mind, what types of hallucinations or emotions they might induce. But there are also, of course, the chemical ways of classifying psychedelic drugs, and specifically by how similar they are to the brain's own neurotransmitter and receptor system. So last time we talked about anticholinergic and serotonin-like psychedelics. Today we'll talk about three different classes. The ones that are more like, or at least shaped more like, the catecholamines, like dopamine and norepinephrine. Ones that act on the glutamatergic system and specifically block NMDA receptors. And then finally this weirdo kind of class of psychedelics that are based on a very specific type of opioid receptor in the brain. All right, so going forward, let's jump into the catecholamine-like drugs. So like it says, these psychedelics structurally if you look at their chemical structure, they share a lot in common with the catecholamines we already know and love from this class. So including dopamine and norepinephrine. We've talked a lot about dopamine and a bit about norepinephrine. We'll talk more about norepinephrine later on, but this is interesting in that the shape is very, very similar between, let's say, mescaline, as you can see here in this plot, and the dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine at the top. All right, so structurally very similar. Structure doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't mean that these drugs, mescaline, for example, exclusively binds to dopamine and norepinephrine receptors. The shape is a bit different, so that chemical can actually bind to other receptors. And as I'll talk about in a bit, it can bind to some of those serotonin receptors that we've already learned are critical for the psychedelic hallucinogenic component of things like LSD or psilocybin. All right. So what does taking some of these catecholaminergic drugs feel like? Well, I mean, there are differences. The mescaline experience and the MDMA experience are very different from each other, but there's some general similarities. Overall, there's this blend of stimulation and hallucinogenic actions. So probably because of their similarity to the chemicals in the brain that we already think are associated with stimulant effects like dopamine and norepinephrine, maybe that drives some of that stimulant effect of these drugs. And then the hallucinogenic actions, that occurs probably due to the effects of these drugs on the serotonergic system. All right. And there's a word for this interesting mixture of stimulant and hallucinogenic actions, and I've mentioned it at the very first class, called entactogens. And these are drugs that, again, have that interesting mix where they both stimulate and then produce hallucinations. And then empathogens it's a little more specific, where empatho means empathic, where you have this experience of emotional communion or oneness or openness to people and others. This is like empathy or sympathy. And so that's another effect of these drugs, and especially ecstasy, MDMA. So these are two general commonly reported effects of these drugs. And again, the ones I'll talk about now are mescaline from peyote and MDMA from a drug company back in the day. So it's completely synthetic. All right. So I'm just going to show this just to, again, show you the shapes of these drugs. Amphetamines, DOM, mescaline there is in the upper right corner. Those are the catecholamine-like. Just to compare and contrast them with the shapes of the chemicals of these serotonergic drugs like LSD you see in the left. And so that's just to say that these drugs are very small molecules, first off, and they share a little bit in common with the serotonin-like drugs or the serotonin molecule, but they're different. They don't have the catecholamine-like don't have that pentagonal structure. They just have this one phenyl ring, this six-sided carbon ring, but they don't have that additional pentagonal ring attached to them. So yeah, structurally they're a little bit different, and so that might explain why they have different psychological effects as well. You don't have to memorize these shapes, but it's just to show the differences in the drugs. All right, moving on to mescaline. All right, so mescaline is this, again, it's actually interesting. It's local to us, local to especially New Mexico and northern Mexico. It's a small spineless cactus. And so you can cake the cactus, you can cut it. It has the juices and saps or so in the cactus can be extracted, and they contain the mescaline. And it's been used for thousands and thousands of years. So they've been recorded in history from the very earliest Spanish explorers and settlers. But yes, it's been used by native cultures for far, far, far longer, well before the Spanish ever came. And it's legal today if you're a member of some of the Native American churches to use, because it's a very critical or key component in some of their religious ceremonies. All right, so despite it being a catecholamine-like shape in the molecule. What's interesting about mescaline is that it does, it does act on your dopamine and norepinephrine system, but it also acts on this 5-HT2A receptor. And we've already learned that for the classic psychedelics like LSD, that's the main receptor that's involved, at least that we know of so far, that's involved in the psychedelic effects, the hallucinogenic effects. Okay. All right, which brings me to Young Guns. All right, now the only reason I'm bringing up Young Guns, if you have not seen it, which wouldn't be surprising since it came out in 1988, I saw it probably back in 1988, so it left an impression on me. You might enjoy looking at some of the faces in this movie poster. There's Kiefer Sutherland, and then you can have some fun identifying the other famous faces in the poster. Yes, they were so young back there. I think Charlie Sheen's there, but yes, so young. Anyway, so that was a seminal movie for me, but I'm just bringing it up because that was a movie that they had a peyote scene. If you want to check out the scene, it's pretty funny. But anyway, it's an interesting movie, but you can see them tripping, all those young guns tripping out on mescaline. All right, but what does it feel like? Probably because these catecholamine-like drugs are acting on the norepinephrine system. It might help contribute to the effect of producing anxiety. Norepinephrine is associated with anxiety. And it can definitely activate, similar to that, it activates your sympathetic nervous system, the sympathomimetic. As I said before, that's activating your fight or flight system. It also produces these visual, very vivid hallucinations. It can lead to vomiting. And there's some things that make it kind of a little psychotomimetic. It makes it more like a psychosis-like state, somewhat semi-similar to schizophrenia, although different, much less like the schizophrenic-like state produced by the drugs we'll talk about in a moment that act on the NMDA receptor, like ketamine and PCP. So it's not quite as psychotomimetic as those drugs, but it's also psychotomimetic. And it can lead to very vomiting, lots of vomiting, and very long lasting. Unlike certain drugs like DMT, which might be only 15 minutes, that's again a serotonergic drug, a psychedelic. This drug, the peyote, the mescaline, can have a very, very long lasting effect up to around 10 hours. And again, it's only legal to use this drug if you're a member of the Native American Church, at least here in the States. I don't know what Mexico's rules are. Okay, so yeah, interesting drug, again, used for thousands of years, and these are the general effects. All right, okay, that's the Roadrunner from my backyard is there to remind me that that is the end of segment 1 of 4 of the second classes of psychedelics lecture. I'll talk to you in a moment.